don't have a share button on your, I guess your privacy setting
Oh, I might, yeah, it
such that.
might
So I
have
just,
been default on the friends
yeah,
only.
I just put it screen grab and then I put it on my page. So there's a few people that I know that have said they're going to watch. So
All right.
not that we're
Should be a
going to.
little light that flashes that says we're live. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So,
I can see a little red flag in the upper left.
yep.
Okay.
All right. Welcome back to Wonder Whaticon. I'm your host, Chad Hindall. Today we have animator Rich Danny's with us. Thank you for joining us, Rich.
Thanks for the invite, Chad.
I talked to Rich last weekend about joining, and he had some stuff going on, but I'm glad we got him this weekend. He's joining us from Toronto, Canada, where he's currently working on Green Eggs and Ham.
Yep, second season.
I haven't caught all of the first season yet, but it has been what I have caught has been really exceptional.
Yeah, the studio I work at, they actually worked on the first season quite a bit too, but not really as a full. It was kind of like a bunch of disparate animators kind of working on it. I mean, finding classically trained animators is almost the most difficult job, finding those people that are any good. But now, yeah, I was just kind of doing it as more of a bigger production in-house kind of. So when I worked on it, I was working on it for, I thought for Pascal Blaise Studio, a Montreal studio that has a very good reputation. But then about halfway through, I started getting checks that said Tonic DNA, and I didn't quite understand. But apparently the owner, Pascal Blaise, famous animator, he sold the studio. So I was working underneath a different regime, kind of. But I worked on episodes 6 and 8 of the first season. So I think I posted most of the layout stuff on my corporate page on my Facebook page.
Yeah, I've actually got some of that on here. I can show.
Right. I'd love to show you some of the stuff we're doing now, but of course the NDAs are disallowing, showing any of the artwork.
Naturally.
Yeah.
These might be a little out of order as I go through them here.
Yeah, that's the beginning of I guess the 8th episode sequence that I did. It was at the biker bar. The designs were pretty thorough for this entire sequence, so I didn't really have too many issues to worry about. I remember that I had to move some of the motorbikes around because just for staging issues, just to make sure it would all work. But that's almost right off the design, and that one isn't quite off the design, but I had to it's such a detail rich background that you had all these little specific paintings, and they actually gave me design sheets where they had details of all the paintings, but the only way to kind of get my way through all this was to sort of design the architecture of the room and then wallpaper parts of the designs in there so that I could sort of maintain the proportions and the scales properly.
I was going to ask, since you've now moved to working digitally over traditionally, are you designing all of these assets separately and then combining them?
Well, you work on it piece by piece, layer by layer. Like for instance, this background here would be the room itself, and then you would have like ceiling wood texture, floor wood texture, and then after that you would put on the paintings in perspective as another layer on top of that, and then working yourself to the higher layers, you would put the pool tables and the lamps on separate layers, and then the foreground bar in a separate layer, and then the props that are on the bar would be also on another layer. And that way the animator can sort of animate the characters between all the stuff that they need to.
That's really interesting, and I was interested to get into your viewpoint a little bit, having been in the field for over 30 years and going from traditional to digital, and how that's changing, and how even like what are you hearing rumblings of things with like VR and Oculus starting to become more and more of a creative tool?
Well, it's funny because the pendulum, the studio that I work at now is really the only studio in the city that really has those, that still has some of those roots in the old school ways. So in a way, it's kind of the ideal place for me to work. But I really had a struggle when I had to sort of make the transition from, old school paper and pens and pencils to digital. That was not an easy thing for me to do, because I think after I did Ripping Friends, and that probably would have been around the early 2000s, work just sort of dried up. I mean, it was right after 9/11 that kind of really had an impact on the industry as well. But after that, everybody kind of moved to, it probably happened even before then, but everybody moved to digital. And the only layout that was being done was really flash layout, which is all vector lines. And, I didn't have any experience doing illustration or Illustrator, using Adobe Illustrator. And
I
I didn't
struggle with vector a lot.
and I don't really like the look of vector art to begin with. So I was kind of resistant to it from the beginning. And I always thought, well, another job is going to come along where I can do what I've always done. And that's a foolish way to think of things, because you do sort of put yourself into a very small box, and then you're sort of asking the rest of the world to please adjust to my shortcomings. So I think after that, I did a job at a studio that was a really horrible studio called Core Digital. I worked on a cartoon called Iggy Arbuckle. Now, this was a place that was originally a VFX studio that William Shatner had invested in as part of, he was getting the studio to do all the special effects for his TV series. And I can't even remember what the series was called. But then they transitioned to doing 3D animation, and they did a lot of that effectively and did a good job of it too. And then they decided they wanted to have a 2D sort of component to the studio. But they had 0 desks, like they were all kidney bean shaped desks, and everybody had a computer on it, and there were no Cintiqs, there were no Wacoms. So I said, how are we going to do this? Because it wasn't even an angled desk that you could work on. It was like a flat desk. So people were wrecking their backs hunched over on these little small kidney beans, where the computer was taking up the majority of the space on the table. And it was just a mess. So I said, how are we going to do this? So they sort of slowly tried to ramp up and get people to work in a digital way, but it was just frustration after frustration. And I think I didn't make it into past my sort of probationary period where you become a full-time employee. I think you get 3 months or something to ramp up. And I think right before that last week, I think they basically fired my ass. And I said, well, why? Like I went through a whole list of, why they weren't doing what they needed to do to sort of make the artists comfortable to pull this production together. And they said I wasn't a team player. So I don't know what that means exactly. Too many arguments. And I've had a history of having arguments with people, but for the most part, it's all worked out. So
Yeah.
It can be a frustrating business sometimes.
I had a similar experience in Austin, Texas. I was working on storyboarding on Sin City 2.
Okay.
And I was about 5 days in, and they shut down production. And they tried to move me over to Machete 2 for a little bit, and then that kind of went on hiatus for a little bit, and I ended up moving. And the first weekend I moved to Kansas, I got a phone call saying, hey, we're ready to start production again. Can you come back? I was like, oh, great.
Yeah. Thankfully, drawing skills are still sort of held at a premium. So, I mean, you can still find other things to do if the one thing doesn't work out. And I mean, in a way, it was kind of a blessing that I didn't stay with that company. I think they probably went bankrupt, I think 4 months after they fired me. Like, it was a horribly run studio, just bleeding money in all kinds of different ways, because they had a whole 3D staff that really didn't have much to do either, and a huge building that apparently the owner had bought, and it was right in downtown Toronto with prime real estate. So I'm sure there was all kinds of taxes and monies that he had to pay on that space as well. So
had the ideas, but not the execution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, that happens a lot in animation and comics and film.
It happens, more than people think. I mean, when I think about all the studios that I worked on in the city that are no longer around, I mean, the new ones pop up and then old ones kind of wither away. The people that really seem to know what they're doing, they have some longevity. So, Yowza is a studio that has got relatively new ownership. The woman that owns it now bought it when I was working on the Welcome to the Wayne digital series.
Mhm.
But before that, it was run by four Chasson brothers, four guys from Quebec, who had a great reputation for doing old school classical animation. So there's Roger, who's an animator, and Claude, who can also animate, but handles most of the cleanup. So those two guys are still working on Green Eggs and Ham, and they do both of those jobs. And then they've got another brother, Pierre, who kind of helps run the production smoothly. And the fourth brother, I think he's kind of out of the business. I'm not exactly sure. I've heard he's had health issues. But yeah, those guys, if they weren't in the Yowza studio now, I think it'd be quite a different sort of looking studio. So
Even with the proliferation of digital, it seems like there's been a groundswell, maybe slow but sure, but there to preserve 2D animation.
it seems to be making a bit of
techniques.
a comeback. Like the pendulum seems to be swinging back, which I love. I mean, when I first saw Green Eggs, I couldn't believe how great it looked. Like I couldn't believe that a series like that existed, that somebody would spend that kind of money to make it look as good as it does.
Yeah, it's incredibly fluid.
Yeah, it's a really beautifully looking cartoon. And I think the second season, I'm a little biased, but I think it's actually going to look better than the first season. So everything's amped up. So
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I know I've been hearing some rave reviews from friends' kids and stuff too, that they're really enjoying it. And
yeah, the second season is only going to be 10 episodes, and Yowza was contracted to work on four of the 10, and then the other 6 are done at a studio called Snipple in the Philippines. So it's a little peculiar. They because sometimes you're working on an episode and you go, wait a minute, how does that make sense with the last episode we worked on? But we're working on episode 2, 4, 7, and 9. So the finale, they sprinkled us in kind of between the Snipple episodes so that they kind of have some uniformity to the look of the whole thing too. So hopefully there won't be too much disparity between the episodes. I mean, the stuff that I saw Snipple do in the first season looked great too. So I'm sure it's all going to look great.
I'm going to use that to jump back a little bit. I've listened to the interview you sent me.
Right, the Jake Williams one, yeah.
And, over the few years that we've kind of, I guess, known each other, we've talked a little bit, and I've heard you tell some stories.
How did we first meet? Did we meet on Facebook, or did we meet at the drawing board?
Yeah,
do you remember that?
It was either something to do with Xenozoic or Rocketeer.
Oh, that could be, yeah.
There's some kind of overlap there because I was working on a song for the Xenozoic, what is it called? Xenozoic Tale. There's a radio show that was going on.
Right, yeah.
For a little while. And then, I've had a couple pieces in the Rocketeer galleries and been involved with that. So there's some kind of crossover there where we ended up meeting.
That's quite possible, yeah.
You started, you offered me some kind words and some support over the years. So we've got
well, us artists got to stick together.
You started out doing classical animation at Sheridan College.
It was a 3-year program back then. It was a community college where tuition was, I think I mentioned, it was like $660 a year. And nowadays they're paying, I think international students have to pay close to $10,000 a year. It's an insane amount of money. And they made it a 4-year degree university program. And when I was working on Ripping Friends at Red Rover Studio, I remember they had some of the management from the school. Um, they were actually conducting polls at a lot of the different studios to ask the opinions of professional artists that were in the business now about what they thought of the idea of expanding it to a 4-year program. And I just wrote very plainly on the thing that I thought it was a complete cash grab. And I didn't think there was any reason why it had to be a 4-year program. And it just seemed like they were preparing the school to cycle kids through, it's like, I call it shearing the sheep. Nowadays it's very, very difficult even to get into the program on your first go. Like they'll take a look at your portfolio and they'll say, well, your stuff is really not good enough. You're going to have to take the art fundamentals program before you can reapply to the animation program. And they use that too as a component where they can kind of generate some more income.
Right.
I don't know. I'm very dissatisfied with even the talent that's coming out of it. I won't say that about the current year because we had actually had a few people from Sheridan that were, when they had their summer off, they were working on our show. And some of those artists were unbelievably talented. But I know some of the other layout people in the city that are working at different studios, and they've always said that, some of the Sheridan portfolios are some of the worst ones that they've seen. So,
Oof.
yeah, that's not good to hear. It's just a lot of people that don't really respect the idea that drawing is really the foundation of the whole thing. Like they're always trying to find ways to not do the drawing. They don't want to do the hard work. So that's frustrating, especially on a show like that where we're doing right now. Is where if you don't like the draw, then you better find another show to work on because there's a lot of friggin' drawing to do. So
yeah. And like I never did get the opportunity to go to any higher education. And that's something I've been kind of trying to work in here and there over the years.
Even when I went to Sheridan, it was the synergy of the other students was really where you did most of your learning. I don't want to poop on the instructors I had, but they were not really the greatest talents to begin with either. They were very encouraging and very insightful in a lot of ways, but when you see some of the work that they did, I hate to use that or axiom about where if you can't, those that can't do teach, or, but there's a little bit of truth to that, I think, unless you've got all the money that you need in the world and you're just feeling very philanthropic, or you want to sort of share the wealth of information that you have. But I got into teaching only because I couldn't find work. That's the reality of it. So, and eventually that changed. And then there's some people that do try to do both. They just like they enjoy it. And, I didn't. I enjoyed it when I did it, but I don't know if I would still do it.
After your Sheridan experience is when you actually moved over to doing comics retail for a while, right?
Yeah, I dropped out of Sheridan. It's interesting because I grew up with comics, and then somewhere along the way, I just did not collect comics. The only time I really had comics is when the family would go on long trips. My mom and dad would always make a point of hitting the newsstand first, realizing that if they bought 5 comics each for us, that would be 10 comics for us total, me and my brother. And the trip down to New Jersey's Cape May would be a lot shorter if they didn't hear us arguing and fighting in the backseat. So that worked out quite well. But then
the same experience there.
Yeah, it's kind of a pacifier for kids. But then when I reached college, I was traveling with I sort of hooked up with a friend that used to live where I'm living now in Oshawa. He actually lived in Whitby, and we would travel on the GO train to school every morning. And he clued me into the fact that on Queen Street West in Toronto, there were 3 or 4 direct retail comic shops, which I had not even heard of. It was kind of a new thing, I guess. I don't know what year it started, but yeah, there were a whole bunch of shops down there. So We would go there, sometimes if we had a late class, we would go there in the morning. Or if we had an early class, then we would hit it on the way home. And then I somehow hooked into buying heavy metal. Because I mean, I had an interest in comic books, but I wanted something that was more my own age.
Mhm.
So I started buying heavy metal and all the back issues, and I just went through them all, and I just was really turned on by the art of Mobius and Enki Bilal and Juillet and all these other guys. And then one issue had a profile of the studio with Wrightson, Jones, Smith and Kaluta.
Mhm.
And I recognized even in the blurb there that I could recognize Wrightson's because they talked about Swamp Thing, and I knew that had bought Swamp Thing when I was a kid. And Kaluta's Shadow, I think I might have seen one of those. And so then I went back and started to look specifically for those artists. And that hooked me into the whole DC House of Mystery and House of Secrets. And I just went on a whole run where I would save up all my money to go buy back issues of that stuff as well. So,
Which eventually that mood of comics kind of became Vertigo, where what's
yeah, true.
modern readers know as the
It really
Vertigo
did
kind
spin
of.
off a bunch of other stuff, yeah. But then when I had dropped out of Sheridan, I told a couple of my buddies, I said, well, what I really want to do is draw comics. But I didn't realize that there was zero money in working in comics. I mean, even those guys were struggling through most of their careers. But so I thought, well, the best way to sort of be around comics was to work retail. So I think I found a job. Mark Asquith used to run the Silver Snail comic shop in Toronto. He's kind of almost like ground zero of the comic book community. I mean, it all sort of comes out from Toronto Silver Snail and Mark Asquith, because later on he went as a producer of the Space Channel, and he still maintained a lot of comic book promotion and stuff like that. But the owner of the Silver Snail also owned Andromeda Distribution, was a comic book distributor. Before there was Steve Geppi and previous catalog, there were probably about a dozen different distributors just in North America alone. So
it's kind of regional based to an extent.
Totally, yeah. So we used to prepare orders for shops all over Canada, mostly Toronto and Ontario, but then to Ottawa, and then we always had accounts in Montreal and a few in BC and out west. So I worked there for a number of years. And then I also,
interesting.
Sorry, so the guy that I traveled with, Kevin Kliss, the guy that also went to school with me, by this time, I think he had graduated Sheridan and was just sort of floating around. And I got him a job at the warehouse as well. And then I think he somehow got a job doing layout on Beetlejuice at Nelvana, and said, hey, they're looking for other artists. You should take a test. So that's what I did. And then I got the job. That was in 1989. So that was kind of my foot in the door.
Really quick before we move on to the animation career, because I have various tiers I kind of want to hit in there.
Right.
Still on the comic retailer side of things, obviously we're seeing a big shift in the market right now. Publishers are starting to look for other inroads, and throughout the last weekend and the last couple of weeks, I've talked to other pros and creators about this, of how they're actually thinking that probably we're looking at a shift back to those more broken up regional distributors.
It does seem to be headed in that direction, yeah. I mean, I know the comic shops are really hurting right now. It pains me to see how many shops are, having trouble making rent, because we have a nice shop here in Oshawa, and I know it's got to be closed down since the whole, quarantine sort of shut everybody down. So I don't know how they're sort of faring, but it's tough.
I guess from that, have you seen, like, in animation, is there do you feel like people are more accepting of digital content? I guess it makes more sense being animation, but is there kind of a purism there too, where it's like, no, it doesn't really count unless it's going to be, on a, like, even cable, I guess, or it's going to be on streaming, or part of a?
No, I don't think there's any kind of snobbery about where it is or how it is. It's more the fullness of the animation that people take issue with. I think the platform really doesn't matter to most people. I mean, Netflix has really been a godsend in a lot of ways for the animation community because it's just opening up because they have so much money to produce. The projects are getting better and better. I mean, I don't know if a Green Eggs and Ham would have existed without Netflix, to be
Right.
honest. So
You get like Love, Death, Robots.
yeah, it's amazing. I mean,
I thought it was
I mean,
gorgeous.
if you saw the Robert Valley episode, it's really incredible.
Yeah, I watched all of them multiple
Yeah.
times at this point.
Yeah. I mean, that's
And
exciting
they
because when I went to Sheridan, we were always advocating for adult animation, and it was always frustrating to us, that that couldn't sort of make an inroad. But the Death, Sex, and Robots is a good example of where things could go. You know what I mean?
Right, and then they just did the Altered Carbon. They did a animated feature of that as well.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
It was pretty neat. And on the children's side too, like something like Secret of Kells, I thought was just really, really well done. Had a lot of heart to it.
Definitely.
So it's
Yeah.
definitely an exciting time to
Yeah,
have
because
an
I'm
eye
always
for-
I'm also hoping to see more. Like people ask me, well, what do you want to work on? I said, well, I always want to work on something that has some sort of connection to comic books. That's kind of my thing. Realizing a comic book as an animated, not a 3D, but it might be 3D, but as a classically animated feature or series, that stuff is exciting to me. And as much as I like Bruce Timm's Batman animated series, I always felt like it still could have gone a little bit further. It always seemed like they were doing the sort of the low end version of what it is, kind of now. But because people say, well, what are you going to do after Green Eggs and Ham? I said, I really don't know, but I want to do something like this. I don't want to have to go back to, what I call vector art type backgrounds, where you're basically accessing libraries and dropping in a tree here and, putting a house here. That stuff is pretty tedious. But I know that Jeff Smith's Bone has got greenlit into some kind of a feature or a series, and something like that would be amazing to work on.
Well, use that to parlay into the your animation career. You mentioned earlier Beetlejuice. That was your first kind of big project you worked on.
Yeah, that was a lot of work. I mean, I didn't realize how much layout work was involved. I didn't realize how much work was involved in putting together a layout. But you hear about everybody that's their entry into the business. They say, well, the first year is tough because you just are not prepared for the workload. You're not prepared for drawing that much. You always think that it's going to be a little less work than it actually is. And I forget what the quota was, but I think you had to have like 15 scenes a week. And if you had a bunch of reuse folded inside that 15, it wasn't so bad. But there were weeks when I struggled to make quota. So, and I think after a while it did kind of burn me out. And I think I basically quit Nelvana once or twice. I'm not sure. But the second time I know it was because I was sort of missing deadlines and I could see the guy coming. And I said, yeah, I think I should quit too. So that's when I kind of retreated to comic book retail. And I think I worked at the Dragon Lady shop for a little while. I don't know if you remember, but Dragon Lady Press was a thing at the time, and it had all the nice Alex Toth covers on the old Roy Crane reprints or Milt Caniff reprints and stuff like that. So it was basically that owner had a publishing arm and also had the shop. And so I kind of got back into comic books again, doing that type of stuff. So, and then eventually, I can't remember what year it was, but that's when I heard that Nelvana was going to be doing Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, adapting Xenozoic Tales. And that was my entry back into the animation business, because I definitely wanted to be a part of that.
Some of that I can share here. Obviously, that's a big one for me. I'm a huge fan of Xenozoic.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I'm a huge Mark Schultz fan.
And Mark Schultz is just probably my favorite living, black and
Yeah.
white based illustrator. Um,
My design supervisor at that time was Ted Bastine. He's now gone on to become a director of Paw Patrol at the Guru Studio, but he used to tease me relentlessly about being such a Mark Schultz nerd. He would do really funny drawings of me hanging on to Mark Schultz's ankles and saying, "Come back, Mark." Because one time they did actually visit the studio. They came through our department, and I'd never even really met the guy, so I was kind of awestruck. I think he came by with Marv Wolfman, I think the writer, Marvel writer, because I think he wrote some of the episodes as well.
Yep.
But the producer basically scurried them through. She didn't want them sort of to be polluted by talking to the actual artists working on the show, because then they were going to hear about all the problems. So she hustled them through, and I think even though they wanted to talk to us, the producers did not want them to talk to us. So.
I'm hoping to get Mark on here in the coming weeks, but
That'd be great. Yeah.
it's really an amazing cartoon in how much it was different, but still the same.
Yeah, I mean, it was for Nelvana, it was the first foray into sort of doing action adventure, which is kind of exciting. You felt like you're on the front edge of something. But then the next season, there was no next season of Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, but they got us all. They kept most of the crew together, and they got us all to work on Jim Lee's Wildcats.
Which that's what I was going to get into next. That to me is amazing how on model you guys were able to kind of keep everything, with the comics.
The character design was really, really well done, but the thing about that show was that it was half the budget and half the schedule of Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and I felt like if they hadn't have taken that sort of radical cost-cutting sort of step, we would probably still be doing action adventure cartoons at Nelvana. I thought it was really short-sighted of them not to think of it that seriously. But, their comfort zone was always doing kids fair, like Care Bears, the bar, and finding the artists that are capable of doing an action adventure show. That's not that easy either, because there are a lot of comic nerds in the city, but not all of them can do animation. So
Right.
Yeah.
I was a child, of that era. Image was big. I was 10 years old when Image started, and
yeah, you would have been the perfect age.
yeah, it really was. And I still have really fond memories of the cartoon. It doesn't hold up the best, but
No.
it's
I can still watch a little bit of it, but I was really a little bit too old to be a huge Image guy. Like, I didn't understand what the fascination was with guys that were dripping all of their characters with a lot of line work. It seemed superfluous. It didn't really add anything. Like, it was different from the way a Wrightson would have done it. And I kind of grew up with Wrightson and Kaluta. Those are my guys.
Well, I'm thankful that through a lot of those Image guys, I've been able to discover, the studio guys, and go back and find Mobius and
that's true.
Dave Stevens and Mark Schultz, and
yeah, for sure.
It was from those guys and them talking about their influences that I was able to go, oh, okay.
yeah.
This is how you play the game.
Yeah, there are no shortcuts to good drawing.
Well, I'll parlay that into Dave Stevens and the Rocketeer, something we both have great affection for. It's
I mean, he very when I was going to Sheridan, I can remember Pacific Comics coming out right around that time. This would have been like 82, 83. And me and my buddy Kevin, the guy I described, we actually used to make bud plant orders, and we'd have them delivered to the school. So we would just, every once in a while, you get a huge package and you would just crack them open. And he was buying stuff like, that's when Kirby had come back and did Captain, what's it called again? I can't remember.
Fighting American?
It wasn't Captain America, because it was his own character. But
Fighting American?
What's it called?
Fighting American?
Maybe. I think that's the one he did with Simon as well, though, right? Simon and Kirby? I can't remember.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this was a different one. But anyway, Pacific Comics was a great publisher at that time. And that's when, of course, they got Dave to do the Rocketeers. So he was actually buying those, and I thought, wow, this guy has really got it. Like that's kind of clued me into that. So after that, I was buying everything that he, had ever touched, and I was a huge fan because I really saw him as kind of the purest link to maybe those older artists that I really liked. Like I know he was a Frazetta nut, and for me, Frazetta still is that kind of at the top. I mean, talking about his comic art, not the painting. The painting is great too. Don't get me wrong, but the comic art is what just sort of stays with you. And so yeah, that sort of direct, sort of linear, sort of relationship between him and the old Reed Crandall stuff too, stuff like that. Early Steranko, and so yeah, I really got hooked on his stuff. So then before I looked it up today, and before I had actually even started at Nelvana, the Amazing Heroes preview special came out where they were talking about Rocketeer number 3, I think, or number 2, I can't remember which, one of the later issues. And he was talking about how much of a struggle it was to work on the book. Like he was really having a hard time, especially with the penciling. And he was talking about sort of the shortcomings of the comic book industry, blah, blah, blah. And it really resonated with me, absolutely. Like he was saying all the things that I felt inside. So, and I don't do this very often, but I wrote a fan letter to him saying that, boy, your words really spoke to me, and said how much I loved his work, and I included a couple samples. And then he wrote back a very, very dear letter that in November of 1988, saying that he was looking for pencilers and maybe I'd be interested in it and trying it out. And I almost fell over. Like I couldn't believe that was even a possibility. I was ecstatic. So, and then he sent me up a follow-up postcard, asked me for my phone number. Sent me a postcard in January of '89 saying that he was going to send me a page from Rocketeer number 3 to try out. And he was going to send me all the reference that I needed. And I wrote back, said, I can't wait to see it. And then I waited through February and March and April. And I just got the sense that this was not going to happen. And I was very, very disappointed. So it was, but it taught me an important lesson in that you shouldn't wait for others to help you realize your own dreams. Like that's really kind of my mistake for sort of falling into that trap. Yeah. So it was bittersweet. But then when I guess down the road in 1999, I had worked out with a friend who was also a huge Dave Stevens fan, Tom Ranheim. He did the original official Dave Stevens homepage, had all the artwork on it, gave the whole history of what he had worked on and when he'd worked on it and stuff like that. We decided we were going to go to the San Diego Con together. And I think Tom had some preliminary sort of correspondence with Dave as well. So we were going there basically to meet Dave. Now, when Tom went there, he went there as a fan. He just wanted to meet the guy. But me, I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder because this is the guy that had also disappointed me. You know what I mean? And he never really copped to that fact, but he might have felt bad about it. Like he didn't really look sheepish about it. But it was an awkward first meeting. But the guy's such a sweet guy that, I mean, he just kind of won me over like in the first 10 minutes. So I forgot all about that. And then he very graciously took us out to dinner and showed us his workspace back in Los Angeles after the show was over. And we just got to talking to him. So then after that, I basically had a bit of an email correspondence with Dave. Gave him his phone number. Like I could, I tried phoning him one time, but I didn't have that sort of code where you're supposed to phone, then hang up and then phone again. Or he had some sort of system that he worked out with Steranko where, he'd have these long sort of conversations. And I really didn't want to pester him to that degree anyway. Like the email was fine for me. I didn't really, so. But yeah, then I went in 2001, me and Tom went again. And then in 2003, I went on my own. And by that time, Dave had already done a sketchbook and I wanted to kind of do a sketchbook as well. So I basically self-published a sketchbook and Dave was gracious enough to let me sell it from his table, which is kind of, for me, that was a big, huge thing.
Wow.
Because then Bud Plant came by and said, "Who's this guy?" And then, "Oh, well, if you got extras, give them to me afterwards." And So it was kind of an introduction. Everybody that came to Dave's table also I got to shake their hand as well too, right? So that was kind of like pretty trippy. It's like the ultimate fan experience.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, all the offers this guy got too. Like I could tell there were a lot of film people coming by saying, we've got this job we'd like you to do. First thing that Dave would always do, he'd always say, well, I don't really have the time, but I've got this friend, Mike Kaluta, who, I want to try. Like, he was constantly pushing work off to friends and peers and I thought, don't you need the money? Like, why wouldn't you do that? But he was too focused on what he wanted to do. Like, I think he knew how much time it took him just to do what he wanted to do, that he didn't need a lot of distraction. So,
yeah.
But I sort of reread the piece that Bill Stout had written about Dave on his passing, and I realized that he knew about his diagnosis in 1999. And when I think about the fact that when I first met him in 1999 at the San Diego Con, that he might have already known that he had, hairy cell leukemia, that blows my mind, because he looked perfectly healthy, did not talk about it in any way, did not even look like he knew like it was going to affect his health or anything. So
It's something he kept relatively private for many years.
very much so. Yeah. And he wanted it that way. And I can totally respect that, because I've had a situation where relatives have come down with a cancer diagnosis, and it's nice to have people know, who are looking or who are thinking of you and looking out for you, but to have everybody know and then pester you about it every week saying, what's the progress, and inviting the whole world into your diagnosis is not the best thing, I don't think, either. So
Yeah, it can be a daunting on the emotional bandwidth of a person, for sure.
Yeah, and when I went in 2003, he had one of the models, Rebecca Smith, who he's painted and drawn a couple times. I had somehow gotten into my head that they were boyfriend girlfriend, and Rebecca said, "What? No way!" Like, because Dave was quite a bit older than she was, but so she made it clear that they were not in any kind of relationship other than artist and model. But then when I went to see him after the show was over, he invited me to come up and visit him in LA. So I dropped by his house, and Rebecca was there in the house, and she was basically buying all of his groceries. And he had already been complaining about the fact that he had a cold that he just couldn't shake. And I didn't put it together, but I'm sure that had something to do with the illness, progression of the illness. The fact that his immune system was having a fight against something.
I'm glad he had, people there that were helping him the same way that he helped Betty and other people, as he was coming up.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, but it's sad to think that we're not going to see any new art. I mean, I keep hoping that somebody's going to dig up something that I haven't seen, but that's the only thing I can kind of hang my hat on now.
Right.
It's kind of tough that way.
Well, it's one thing I've talked about on all these interviews so far is it's been, if nothing else, a super interesting time for art, all the arts, visual, music.
Yeah.
I'm sure the things we'll see.
There's a guy that's watching our conversation now, who I work with at the studio, called Josh Hill. He was one of my students at Max the Mutt, and I came across an interview that he did with the Max the Mutt School on Instagram the other day, and he was saying that he said, "I'm getting a lot more work done now at home than I ever did at the studio," and I think that's true for all of us. Like, I get that sense too. Like, what do you do day to day? You get up and then you go back to. I mean, our studio, was to set up everybody to work remotely. The IT department set up a whole system so that we can access our work computer and we can get our files and we can work on them. If you've got, Cintiq at home like I do, you can do it here and then send it back. And I think I'm getting a lot more done that way, because the days end up being longer. You don't realize how much time has passed. You got to cook dinner, you got to go to bed, you got to shower. But other than that, what else is there to do? We're stuck in our houses, so you're probably going to get more work done.
It's very little has changed for me. Well, up until the last week, it's been kind of interesting how I kind of tripped into this whole thing. But it's for me the hardest part has just been the empathy factor of all the family and friends where this is such a shock to them.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's tough not getting together with friends for sure. I
but
mean, we have Slack. That's sort of a, I don't know. I mean, I think most workspaces have a Slack sort of channel where it's like a channel that you can kind of.
yeah,
We've got them all divided up by departments too. So we've got a green eggs and ham 2 layout. We've got a green eggs and ham 2 general, and blah 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 blah. And chatting with people is not the same as kibitzing with people in the studio. You know what I mean? It's just
no,
not,
no, it's not.
yeah, it's just not the same thing. So it's a tough adjustment, but
Yeah, as a musician, I can't wait to get back into band practice with my band. And
yeah, I guess doing it all remotely, even if you're hooked up in the Zoom meeting, it's not the same thing, is it? Yeah.
well, no, especially like for harder rock stuff, it's
Yeah.
the energy's just kind of lost there. But
Yeah. Yeah. True.
um, we're getting almost an hour in. I'll probably really quick to. I looked for some of uh, the burlesque stuff, but that was interesting to me because I'm a big fan of that. I've been to a lot of shows, kind of
Yeah.
followed the history of it a little bit. How long has that been kind of
That started,
hobbyist type thing for you?
I would have to blame Dave for that as well. When I was going to Sheridan College in 83, 84, or whatever, 85, and The Rocketeer had come out, and then I found out that Betty Page was actually an actual person. I made a point of trying to find some of the magazines that she appeared in. So in Toronto at that time, there were some backdated magazine shops, where you get old books and magazines from the 50s. So I told the guy, I said, I'm interested in anything with Betty Page content. And he hooked me up with a few old men's magazines. And then inside those men's magazines were strippers who were also doing model, pictorials and stuff like that. And of course, even when Betty had done Teaserama and stuff like that with Tempest Storm, I thought, I think I've heard that name before. And then I started getting interested in Blaze Star and Tempest Storm and all these other people. And then before you know it, because I was interested in Betty, but I was really more interested in the whole burlesque component of it, because these are girls, because Betty had never really performed on stage. She did a lot of, photo shoots, but she had never done anything in front of an audience per se. So I was really impressed that women of the 50s had careers and were making oodles of money and had nationwide followings. Like, that was crazy to me, because the neo burlesque thing now, it's very local, and apart from maybe Dita Van Teese, I don't think that there's anybody that really has kind of an international Miss Mosh, maybe, I'm not sure, but that has that sort of huge sort of profile.
Yeah.
So then I started to get more and more interested in the old burlesque stuff, and then I started to buy more and more magazines. So after I kind of cleaned out the local Toronto stuff, I had to go elsewhere, and this is pre-eBay. So I sort of found, I'm not even sure how I found it, but I found mailing lists for good girl sort of magazines and stuff like that, and collectors who had old stuff. So I used to have mail correspondence, snail mail correspondence with these guys saying that I'm really looking for more stripper stuff. And then the one guy in Chicago clued me into that there was a magazine called Cabaret, which is a very sort of high end, sort of, high end. I mean, the publication had better production value. It was glossy paper, beautiful photos, and it was a sister magazine of Modern Man. So I bought all of those. And then I also found it was a magazine called Cavalcade of Burlesque, which was put together by the Burlesque Historical Society. Some guy in Philadelphia who I think may or may not have run a theater thought this was a great way to promote burlesque and sort of feature articles on the different performers. And so those were almost like historical documents. You'd have all the old flyers and stuff like that, and you'd find out where people were performing and how it all went and stuff like that. So those whole runs, I got those, and then eBay sort of showed up, and then I found out that because there were a lot of old performers or families of old performers that were that basically passed on, and a lot of people didn't know what to do with collectibles. The almost all of these girls always had a scrapbook of their shows and stuff like that because they wanted to record, the history of what they'd done and when they'd done it. So somewhere along the way, I came across a huge, vast collection of Irma the Body, all of her personal effects. There's a girl from New Jersey called Mary Goodneighbor, and some guy in San Diego basically went to a flea market, and the flea market guy told him that, yeah, I bought all this stuff from a landlord who used to rent an apartment to this old performer named Irma the Body. She had no family.
Wow.
And she was behind in her rent. So basically, he was basically the custodian for her entire estate. He basically cleaned out her apartment and tried to sell as much of it as he could to sort of get some of the money back that was owed to him. And this guy from San Diego was now selling it all on eBay. So I thought, this guy's got he's got a gold mine of stuff. And I'd always, in the back of my mind, I even discussed this with Dave, that I had in the back of my mind that I was going to do a biographical series of comics on different performers. But I never really had enough information. You'd have a photo shoot article of a performer, or you would have maybe an old flyer, but you really didn't know much about their lives. Like,
And it'd all be tongue in cheek or in
yeah,
character.
exactly, yeah. So if I could get a hold of a scrapbook or something like that, that would give me a whole timeline from beginning to end of their career and stuff like that. So I basically, it was during the 2001 San Diego Con, I think. Yeah, because it was the second time with Tom Ranheim. And I basically made an arrangement with this guy saying, listen, I'm going to go to San Diego Con. I know you live in the area. Can I come by and buy a bunch of the Irma the Body stuff from you directly rather than go through eBay? And he said, yeah, sure. So he gave me his address. And I went there and I spent quite a bit of money on photos, clippings, all kinds of stuff. And then I told Dave about it, and Dave flipped out. He insisted on seeing all of it. So after the convention was over, we made arrangements to meet up at a diner in LA. It was a big, huge 11 by 17 envelope full of stuff. And I thought he just wanted to see some of the bigger photos, but he wanted to see everything. So I dumped it on the table, and he just went through it one by one by one. And I told him the idea. I'd already mentioned the idea of him to him at the convention about me possibly doing a biographical comic book. And he just turned to Rebecca and looked at her with a smile on his face. So this was obviously something that he had thought of and discussed with her. And he couldn't believe that another guy was telling him about it. So in the back of his mind, I think he had this idea that he wanted to get involved somehow. So he said, can I keep a couple of these photos and to make some prints from them so I can paint? Because at that time he was starting to take oil painting classes. And I said, yeah, sure, take whichever ones you need. And then he made copies, and I got them back through the mail. But then I noticed after he had passed, I looked at my email correspondence, and he'd always asked me about what's going on with that Irma the Body comic. And I'd always have to tell him, oh, I didn't get much done on it, or, another job came up, or I kept pushing it behind. I was just basically procrastinating. And yeah, now I'm kicking myself because what might have been, but yeah.
Well, if you ever kind of start pulling it together again, I'd be happy to throw my hat in the ring.
The game plan now is like my contract goes to, I think, mid-June, and I'm going to do some kind of comic book story with a performer. I can't say it's going to be an entire comic. It might just be a short story. Maybe not something that other than Irma the Body, because that's almost too much to grab onto right now. But I might do something like that if another job doesn't show up that I like. So the benefit of being an older guy with some money in the bank is that you don't have to take the next job, that comes along. And I want it to be a good job. Like this is Green Eggs and Ham 2 is going to be tough to follow, I think. So
I'm working on
it. Yeah.
Like you said in that interview, like you get 3,000 drawings, before you get to the good one, or It was like the 10,000 hour rule. And I've always told told myself, Jack Kirby never created the Marvel universe until he was 42.
That's very true. Yeah, yeah.
I've been
Yeah,
one
you
of those
don't get there
slow
without a lot
build
of
to my slow build to my prime types, but I'm getting there.
yeah, yeah. Good for you. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the time and support you've given to me, Rich, over the years, and
My pleasure,
Uh,
Chad. I always like talking to you. Yeah.
I've
It's nice to have
absolutely,
a face to face rather than the email or the texting.
yeah.
So, yeah. I think you're doing a great job with this Wonder Waticon. I think it's a great idea.
Hey, thank you, man. The feedback's been great, and I've got some great stuff coming up,
Yeah.
some great guests. So, thank you for being a part of it.
All right. My
Is there
pleasure.
anything else you want to plug? Your social media, websites, anything?
No, no. I desperately got to
Uh,
pee. So,
I'm there too. So, yeah, Rich Danny's Instagram, Facebook. You can find them. IMDb.
Yeah.
And
I'm all over
we'll
the
talk to
place.
you all soon.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
All right, Chad. Take care.
Have a good evening out there, everybody.
All right.
Take care, Rich.
Bye.
Bye.